Thank you, Madam Chairman. My first question is for Mr. Butler. Are there any regulatory barriers facing the carriers from operating additional sweeper ships that would help alleviate the excess container capacity at the ports?
Senator, today the answer is no, and that's one of the things that our members are doing to try to clear out some of the empties that have piled up that are getting in the way of everybody being able to move their cargo. It's a good question, though, in the context of some of the legislation that's out there, because there are provisions both in the new Senate bill and in the House bill that would essentially say you have to load all export containers before you can take any empties. And it doesn't work that way. We have to keep both moving, and if we get too restrictive about how we operate our networks, then it's going to make it worse for everybody.
Follow up on that with regard to transparency of data. I know Congress has passed several laws relating to data transparency for how ports are operating, but would additional transparency mechanisms needed for port operations, would they help with that? Could they help the communication between empties and offloading and all of what seems to be jamming up some of the ports right now?
There's no question that better communication can only improve the fluidity in the system, and that's something that really every private sector actor within the supply chain is working on today. In a place like LA Long Beach, where you've got so many terminal operators, so many carriers, so many trucking companies, it's a tremendously complex thing.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure how big the role is, for example, for the federal government in that, but it's absolutely something that is part of the solution.
So how do the private sector providers of coordinate the communications?
Well, so there's probably a different answer for every port, every terminal operator, every carrier, but in broad scope, I mean, the ocean carriers communicate with the terminals that they're going to call while the ship is still at sea. Say, this is when we want to come in, this is what we have on board, and they begin communicating with the inland transportation providers, the railroads, et cetera. So there's a tremendous amount that goes on today. I mean, sometimes when you hear this debate, you would get the impression that nobody's talking to anybody, and that's not true, because if that were the case, we wouldn't be able to move the tremendous amounts of cargo that we move. But having said that, the cargo volumes keep going up, the challenges get more and more complex, and so we have to improve our communications and information sharing to match that. So
there's no role for the federal government in that, correct?
Well, I would never say never. You don't want to say there's no role. There may be some roles in terms of encouraging the exchange of information, but if you're asking me, should there be some federal system to handle all that, I think from our industry standpoint, we would prefer, if you will, to keep that in-house.
Yep. Okay, thank you. With regard to the lack of available storage space for containers coming off the ocean carriers, earlier this fall, I wrote a letter to President Biden outlining several actions his administration could take to help alleviate some of the supply chain issues we're currently seeing. And one of the recommendations was to explore using federal properties for temporary storage for excess containers. Do you believe that's a viable option?
Senator, storage off the ports is something that I think everybody is looking into today. Whether a particular piece of property will work depends on its location, whether it can be secured, whether you can get equipment there.
Yep.
But if we have empty federal properties that meet those criteria, then that's something we should be looking at.
Well, I noted, and I turned this to Mr. Regan, when the gentleman from Georgia was here, he alluded to some of these pop-up storage sites. And Mr. Regan, in your written testimony, you mentioned how the Port of Savannah used federal funds to create off-site overflow container storage areas. What has been the impact for that specific port? And is it an idea that should be expanded to other ports?
Sure. The impact has been to remove some of the bottleneck that is existing at that port. So you're moving some of the containers away from where the offloading is happening, away from the intermodal facilities, and you're creating more of a fluidity at the port. And the reason why that was appropriate in that case was the operator of the Port of Savannah had leftover money from previous federal grants, and they were given the flexibility to be able to use it to address the problem as they saw fit. That may be the best solution in other ports. They may want to use excess money or use federal grants for other purposes, because I think the problems are different at each place, but the flexibility is a key part there, and I think that's a really important part of the way that the administration has addressed this problem.
Well, you sense the frustration of the committee and trying to understand what the role of Congress might be in these issues. I've heard you compliment some of the provisions of the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So I'm hopeful that that can begin to address some of the issues we're discussing today. And I encourage you, when you have other thoughts about how we can help alleviate this problem, we would be grateful for your thoughts. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.